Hello, hello, hello.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Uh, you as well. All right, ladies and gentlemen, our special guest has arrived. He was kind enough to accept my invitation to the live Instagram. Teacher, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Before I do that, ladies and gentlemen, extended family and learners, I have a lot of questions for teacher, and teacher might have some questions for me. But this live Instagram, ladies and gentlemen, is for you. So it would be very nice if you have a question. If you have that little icon button to type in your question, please let us do that. It's easier, at least for me, to see the questions that way versus while we're engaged in conversation that you're talking, we have to do it. So if you could do that, that would be great. Teacher, thank you very much for joining the call. Please introduce yourself and let them know where you are calling from and where you're from, and we'll get right into it. So thank you again for joining, sir.
Certainly. Thank you very much for inviting me for this session. I'm excited about it. So my name is Stuart. I'm originally from England, but now I live in Japan. So
that is, yeah, well, okay. Yes, Teacher Stuart. Well, I got tons of questions for you. You are a teacher who is a native English speaker, and how did you go from the UK to Japan? Let's talk about that.
Fantastic question. So at my previous job, I met what eventually became my wife, and then that led to me moving over here. She's a Japanese native. So.
Excellent. Well, okay, Stuart. So, Teacher Stuart, let me ask you this. Have you always been a teacher, or did you have another career? Like, so for example, before I was a teacher, I mostly was in the business world, and then I transitioned into teaching. So is that similar, or have you just always been in the educational field?
Well, when I went to university, I studied football coaching. So technically some form of a teacher. But after that, I became a manager in a hotel and within management for about 8 years, and then worked with adults with learning disabilities after that. So although teaching is a skill set that can change over with each job, really, when you go into management, you are helping new workers with their new roles, and the same with being a care worker. It's quite similar, actually.
No, to your point, it's interesting, teacher, because I noticed, like, when I made the transition from the business world into the educational arena, to your point, I did notice that there were a lot of skills that were transferable. And I was actually, before I began my teaching career, I was surprised. I was like, oh, there's transferable skills just in terms of communication skills or critical thinking skills or even confidence skills. So I would rightly and readily agree with you. Now, you're teaching. Are you teaching online? Are you teaching face-to-face? Combination of both?
Combination of both. So I was originally, when I moved here, well, still am. I work with the age between 0 to 16 within a school in Japan, and then also I was teaching adults online as well, but I've stopped doing that recently.
Excellent. And for those people, how would you, okay, let's talk about Japan. You're in Japan. That's wonderful. Learners, listen, if you're just joining, we have Teacher Stuart on the call. He is a native English speaker who is from the UK and now lives currently in Japan with him and his family. Stuart, explain to those individuals that might not have necessarily been to Japan or have aspirations to go to Japan. Talk about, like, the level of learning English. Is there a desire to learn it? Kind of talk about the Japanese culture and affiliation, if at all, for English.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's always been, there's been, since they've changed over a little bit from the old style, they've started to become more integrated with English learning within the school system. And actually, as of April, they're going to be changing again to make it from, it was something small, like 72 hours to like over 200 hours worth of English learning throughout. So that's quite a big jump for the guys here. But many parents are interested in learning outside of school. So the kids here do a lot of extra work outside of their normal curriculum. And parents decide whether it's music or sports, or most of them do 2 or 3 different things. So yeah, but a lot of them like to do English.
So Stuart, let me tell you, so when you say okay, so if I understand you correctly, like when they have 2 hours of English, is that at what level do typically the population start learning English? Is that like when you say they have the 200 levels, is that at high school, grade school, what particular age?
So originally, I got to work out my terminology because high school in American and slightly different in
Right,
British.
right. Or even
Right.
like age-wise, just so like if we could get a balance.
So it's around about the age of 12, 13 that they begin for the first time to touch on English. So it's not so dissimilar to the system that I'm from in England, where we'd learn French or German around that age. But now they're
Right.
taking it a step backwards even further, and it's going to be from the age of 6. So that'll be great for everyone. Gives them a good opportunity to speak to many new people.
So age of 6, you're going to start introducing English.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. Okay, so learners, extended family, so notice, you can learn a language at any years, but notice how this particular country has adapted into, hey, teacher Natalie, how they've adapted, and so they changed the role model. Now, how long have you been in Japan teaching, sir?
4 years.
So beside the changes in the number of hours, all right, you saying going from the traditional way to the old way, what other changes have you noticed in terms of like, what other changes are there? Because I would be interested in terms of what you're saying in terms of their old way. What is their old way?
Well, Japan as a country has only been an open country for the last not even 150 years. It was closed off for a big period of their life and eat to any kind of source from outside world. So they've had to do the same amount of development as other countries in like a very short time period. So England had many, many countries visiting at very many different intervals during their time, whereas Japan hasn't had that. And they've had like, had the American style constitution put in after the war, and many different style elements from American and British society has come into here. And I think there must also be some kind of, at one point they must have been very withheld about this big change, because it's gone from their style of culture to more of a westernized style of culture. But Japan's kind of got a nice balance at this moment where they haven't taken too much away from their own culture, which is good.
So they've maintained, okay, so to your point, I think that sometimes, and I would want to get your perspective on this, I do think that depending on where you live in the world, whether it's in Japan or whether it's in the Middle East or Asia or Africa, certain parts of the world, people have, and I love this point that you mentioned, people have sometimes an apprehension of learning English because they might think as though they're losing their culture or they're being westernized. So you're saying that there's kind of a balance between that, where they're maintaining their own sense of cultural identity and yet still using or embracing English. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah. I think now it's more of like not a necessity, but it's seen as more essential because, English is like the world language compared to Japanese, which is very contained within the country. So I think it's seen more as more essential, and the parents are they want to give their kids the biggest chances possible, because even though Japan is a very small country, it has a lot of people. So a lot of people going through the school systems and trying to get the top jobs. So giving them as much opportunity as possible.
And within the educational system as it relates to English or the Japanese society, how would you, I don't want you to stereotype, but how would you categorize the learning pattern? So for example, before I taught in Saudi Arabia, I got my TESOL certification in Chicago. And I taught at my school, which is a neighboring, it's Schaumburg, which is maybe like 40 minutes from where I lived in Chicago. I had the opportunity to have a lot of Japanese students. And how would you describe their approach to English? Is it because some of the students, here's why I asked the question. Some of the students that I had, and this is based on my experience, not stereotyping, some of the experience I had is that they were very grammar focused, number one. Observations I would make. They were very grammar focused. Some were shy in terms of speaking the language. And they loved homework because homework to them was something tangible that they could show to their family that they're actually learning the language. So how would you describe like the English approach to at least some of the students you have since you're in
Well,
Japan?
what you've said is kind of similar to what it is like, although that's beginning to change because of they're beginning to get more big events here. But they had the World Cup maybe 10 years ago. I can't remember the exact date,
Right,
2002
right,
or something like that.
right.
And this year they've got the Rugby World Cup, and then next year they have the Olympics. So they realise that English is kind of essential because, like I mentioned before, you know, English is the world language really, and many people speak it. So they're seeing that as more essential. So they're trying to build it more into the curriculum because of those kind of reasons. But as in for the learner themselves, it's very textbook based for sure. It
Okay.
should I say it has been textbook based. Like say, I don't know before I came, but I know for my job is very different to that. We although we use textbooks in a sense, it is 80%, 90% speaking and
Okay.
focused around the environment rather than just based on the textbooks. But I know the main school system, because I work for a company that's individual, for the main school system, it is mainly textbook based with either a native English speaker is the main tutor or they are just an assistant. So basically the teacher's there for repetition to get used to the sounds coming out of the voice, because you know the level that they're starting at like the age of 12 is just learning ABCs. It's what do they need in that kind of, if that's where they're starting from, you know, do they really
Right.
need an English tutor to be able to learn all of that information?
That makes sense. What's their approach? What is their, in terms of the comment that I aforementioned in terms of homework, is that the norm? Like, for example, there are some students that I work with coming from, because there are different cultural competencies, for example, different
Mm.
cultural similarities. Do your students like the aspect of homework? Because I have some students, not all students here in the Middle East, in Saudi where I'm at, they're like, no, teacher, I don't want homework. So what's the emphasis in terms of homework, or is that changing and evolving as well?
It is not, I wouldn't say it's evolving. It's like a very high, heavy load of homework that maybe they can't carry on their backs all the time. Let's put it that way. But
Okay.
it's so they're so used to it. You know, it's just the style. It's
Right.
what has been put in place for a very long time, and you can see pros and negatives from that kind of style. You know, there is a lot of homework, so I wouldn't say the kids are kids, so they don't necessarily enjoy it, but they maybe as you
Right.
go older and as you mature, you get to understand why it's so important to have that kind of stuff coming back with you, so you can practice, get more and more for your time if you want. So
Right. Well, yeah. No, I think it goes to your point, teacher, because I do think the thing is, again, you know, if we make the argument that English is a global international language, I think it's important to recognize, whether we have learners on the call that go to Japan or go to different parts of the world, even teachers, is understanding the approach that cultures or countries place on English. So, for example, you know, typically my Japanese students, it was like, hey, I had Japanese students, I had Brazilian students, I had Mexican students, and I had Jordanian students, right? And so what was interesting for me is that typically my Japanese students, in comparison, right, when it came to my Brazilian students, they were like, no, I don't want homework, that's too much homework. And my Japanese students were like, no, give me homework, give me homework. So I do think it's important to know. And again, I think there's pros and cons. The good thing is that homework can be given in different ways. Like you said, it might be text-based, it might be video-based, so it's different activities around that. Learners, if you're just joining, hey, we got Teacher Stewart on the phone, and we have a question for you from
sure.
one of the learners. They say, I get advanced level in English, I want a profession in Okay, so basically they want a British accent, Teacher Stewart. They want to sound like you. What recommendations do you have for them to have and sound more like a British person? Hi,
Sure. So
OMG.
it's a super interesting question, especially these days. The internet has unlocked everything for everyone. So the opportunity to hear British accent is so accessible nowadays. There's many people use movies and TV shows to try and hone in their listening skills. I really think practice is the most key thing, though. and maybe that's not so readily available to every learner because of where they live. But mimicking is useful for that, although it's not perfect. But, you know, YouTube is a catalogue of amazing lessons by many amazing teachers who can give you you can see the mouth movements that you're meant to be making, for example, for each part of the accent. But, you know, it's so difficult, that question, because England is just a ball of many, many different accents throughout the whole country. So it's super, I think people see like a newsreader style maybe. And for that, there's plenty available.
Is there okay, so here's a question for you. Is there a preference within the students that you have? Are they looking for British accent, American accent, or are they focused more on fluency? What's the thing? And the reason I mean, I'm one of my learners know this. I'm kind of like, listen, you know, you can sound like a Brit if you want, you can sound like an American if you want, you can sound like a native, but why don't you be fluent first? But with that being said, is there a preference with your students? Do they focus on accent first, fluency, and if so, which do they want to sound like, a Brit or an American, for example?
So, because a lot of my classes are for younger students, the one that I do every day for my full-time job, theirs is all about full immersion. So to get any kind of words or sentence building is more important than the accent per se. For older students, though, in Japan, they're more used to the American accent because that is although there are schools popping up that are British based, American has been the mainstream for English learning here. But that being said, what you said is a good point. I think that just being clear is the most important thing with communication, more so than accent necessarily. And having the ability to be able to use the language is obviously key. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you, teacher. I do think, you know, it's interesting. I think as two native English speakers, not always, that's not true. I find it fascinating that people desire to have an accent like us instead of, to your point, being clearly understood. Now, I do understand some of the reasons for that. It can be considered status. People want to, quote unquote, assimilate. They don't want to be treated as different. So I understand that. And again, I'm not judging it. I just find it interesting. Again, we say that English is a global and international language, and yet we have a large percentage of people that want to sound like us. And I'm like, well, okay, that's fine. But to your point, I'm glad it's nice to be like they want to be understood, and that's a good point.
Exactly, but you know, also.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
But it's just like when you watch football. Sorry, I'm losing some British words here because I work in school. But when you watch football, you want to be like Messi. It's the same thing, you know. It's just you see what you want to. What you see is what you want to be like. And like you say, status is a good example, especially for someone living in maybe a poorer country who wants to be the same as like. Oh, they see Britain as like, or America as like, I have lots of money there. So.
Yeah, you know what, teacher? You do make you know what? And I like the analogy and metaphor that you use with Messi, or, you know, let's expand that. Messi or famous people or other stars. You do make a valid point. So I did not think of that until you made that a point of view. And I agree. So I agree to a point. I think for me is what becomes interesting is when people, two things. Number one is if accent is used to, again, if someone wants to sound like more like a native, that's fine. I think the issue, that I personally has is then when that is used as something that is used as something that's slashing or something that's derogatory. It's like, oh, you don't sound like a Brit. Oh, you don't sound like an American. Yeah. I think that's like my point, you know, because sometimes I've been on lives before or even speaking to people just whether it's online or face-to-face, and I'm like, oh, you don't sound American, you don't sound British, that's bad English and stuff. But I do like the Messi analogy that you used, and that's a really good one, so I need to incorporate that and think about that. That's cool.
What you said there is super interesting in itself because, you know, English evolves massively. Every year new words get incorporated into the dictionary, and people love convenience. So even in and with a native speaker using the language, they don't not use it like a textbook, like a learner would use it. I'd half argue that learners have better English than most natives, you know, because they learn it by the book, whereas we just learn it through immersion. It's a slightly different scenario, and it's super interesting. You know, we use acronyms so much these days, especially when messaging, and I see this, personally, I feel that this may be the way we go rather than grammar. It's almost awkward in a sense, if you get what I mean.
No, it's interesting because I do, you know what, I think to your point, what has been interesting with the advent and the increase of social media, the digital wave, the digital evolution, I do think two things. I think people are speaking generally more informal than they are formally. And I think what is interesting is that, yes, technology in itself has changed at least the nature of, you know, I would make the argument the nature of English as a whole. I'm sorry, the nature of language as a whole, but certainly English. So it might be going to that way to your to your very point. It's a very interesting thing. And I think one of the things on a side note is, it's funny, I finished my class. I started class today for the new semester. And I was asking my students, it's kind of like, okay, well, out of the 4 language skills, which do you like to do the most? And 90% of them were like speaking. And then I asked, which did you like to do the least? And they were like, 95% was like writing. And I do think that is because of the fact that, yes, it might be a harder skill and certainly harder to learn, but I just think the nature of technology has changed it in terms of acronyms and all of that other stuff. It'll be interesting to see if we do move toward that. That's interesting. To your point on grammar, I like the point that you were saying when, you know, non-natives or people that's learning the language as a foreign language or a second language, to your very point. I remember when I first started teaching, I was learning, you know, trying to explain grammar, whether it's conditional statements or verb tenses. And to your point, I knew it intuitively. And how I became grammar was from one of my colleagues who was a non-native who learned the rules. So I think that's a beautiful thing where it's kind of like, you know what, ladies and gentlemen, English is for everyone. So it's not just for us and stuff. So what is it that you, so you became a teacher obviously, but what is it, how did you become it? What do you like? So here's the question. You became a teacher, why? And then if we have like aspiring teachers, learners on the phone that have aspirations to be a teacher, what suggestions do you have for them?
Well, you know, in Japan, the easiest job by far, to be honest, is to be an English teacher if you're a non-native to Japan. So if you're an English speaker. But that being said, as soon as I joined, I fell in love with working with the kids. I mean, I already half did that anyway with my football coaching. But here, another part of the culture is the level of discipline the kids have with teachers is very different. So especially with the age that I'm working with, if it was in England, it'd be a bit different situation. But here I really enjoy it. I love working with them and found like a deep passion for working as a teacher and helping people. And as for people who want to become a teacher, I think it's key in any job you want to do is to have a passion for what you're doing, you know, more so than the money, more so than the status of some jobs, you know. I just think like if you enjoy it, it's so important. Me and my wife have had a similar conversation recently because we just had a kid, so she left her job and now she's got a chance to decide what she wants to do. And I said, it's not, the money's not important. It's important that you're going to stay there for as long as you want because you enjoy it. You know? And I think that's key for any teacher, that any person that aspires to be a teacher. Work out, it's a lot of trial and error. Work out which age group you prefer, whether you prefer teaching formal or informal, or, you know, there's markets for everything these days. And just enjoy it. That's the biggest key. Not everyone can do like a large workload like yourself, who's doing these lives as well as your job, you know, outside of your work. You're doing extra work within Instagram, you know, so not everyone can do that. Some people just have to stick to the 40 hours, but as long as you enjoy it, that's the key, super key thing to do.
I love the fact that you're saying passion. I mean, to me, it's a you said kind of words. You have to be passionate. I mean, that's one of my mottos, like without passion, for me personally, Without passion, there's nothing. I have nothing. And I like the fact where you're talking about, you know, if a person is able to afford it economically, then, you know, I think quality of life, I think, is important. In addition to that, I do think what the beautiful thing about our industry is that, to your point, there's so many different avenues that an individual, whether they're native or non-native, can get into as it relates to the ESL industry or the teaching career. You could be a translator. You can open up a school face-to-face, or a brick and mortar school, an online school. You could do online class. So I do think that, I think that teaching now is different. If you, like, for example, if it's, let's take the passion and quality of life for a side, right? If people want to make a decent amount of living, you know, there are some teachers out there that, you know, are very well known on social media or very well known in their school. So the ability to actually have passion and then also make what a person defines as decent money or a good amount of money to take care of themselves and their families is good. I mean, case in point, I mean, I was in the business world for years, right? And when I made the transition, you know, somebody said to me recently, teacher, well, would you go back in the business world? And I was like, you know what? I think not, just because it's not really, you know, my passion. If it was like teaching in terms of business concepts or something, certainly, but you know, that whole, what I would call corporate America stuff, oh, no. So I think it's a good point. I think it's a good point, definitely. Learners, listen, if you have questions, you got a native, wait a minute, hold on a minute. Public service announcement, where are all the people that have questions for the native English teacher, like accent or whatever? If you're just joining, we have Teacher Stewart on the phone from the UK, currently living in Japan. Congratulations on the birth of the child. Congrats.
Thank you.
So where were your questions, ladies and gentlemen? Zeka from Greece says you are both nice and smiley. Thank you very much. Do you have a question? But let's pause, learners. No, go ahead, John Stewart. No, go.
Please go. I was just going to say it's a good conversation, so that's part of the reason why I think, you know, when the conversation flows nicely, it's natural to smile on it. No, yeah, right. So learners, listen, we're giving you opportunities. So like, I don't want to, because you'll say, teacher, well, you did not add, you know, like, here it is. So if you got questions, again, ladies and gentlemen, just type in that cute question, things of that nature. So Jonathan, let me ask you this. So obviously you're on Instagram. Again, thank you for accepting the invitation. You got to tell me the history and the creation of your profile name on Instagram, because I find it fascinating. Oh, yeah, sure. So Sensei is the word for teacher in Japanese. It's just I don't know, everyone puts the same thing these days, you know, it's just learn English with blah, 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 or, you know, it's that kind of scenario. So I was just thinking, originally I did have a channel that was like Speak with Stu, which is like the same as everyone else. There's probably someone else called Stuart who also had the same title. So I was just like, I renewed myself this month, no, maybe 2 months ago, and decided, how can I do it? Well, I'm in Japan, why not use that? And then, it just worked from there, basically.
I love it. All right, OMZZ, thank you for your question. She has a question for you. Can you give her some suggestions and improvements of not how to forget vocabulary words?
It depends on how you learn. That's the key ingredient to every part of learning, isn't it? So
good point.
There's like many people these days, what is popular is an app called Anki. Many people use this app to deal with repetition. So basically the app, you put in the vocabulary you want to learn. And I've used something similar, and it's a bit it's been useful for me, effective for me, because I'm learning Japanese as well. So this app called Anki, you put in the flashcards, if you want to call them that. And then once you get it correct one day, then it comes up the next day, but then gradually it comes less often. So maybe in a week's time, to see if you can remember over a whole week. So for me, that system is very useful once you're first learning new vocabulary. But the most important thing, I think anyone will tell you, is you've got to use it. You've got to speak. And that's key for any kind of learning, for any part of English.
Right. And at OMZZ, I would say the only thing I would add on to what teacher Stewart is saying is it's like, you know, learn the words in the context or situation. So, you know, so you just don't learn the word in isolation by itself. All right, we have another question from Nature Soft. She's one of my OGM followers. She say, hey, in your opinion, does age have an effect on when trying to learn a language? But let's specifically talk about English. What are your thoughts on that?
Super interesting question for me, because I think you've got to look in perspective in a sense. When we're kids, we don't have bills to pay. We don't have any worries like where our next partner, who will be our next partner or anything like that. When whether we'll get sacked from our job or anything like that. So I feel for an adult, it's much more difficult to retain, not because of age, but actually because of how much information that has to go through our mind every day. Whereas as a kid, you learn from everything around you all the time, and the people around you especially. So in a sense, a younger person will learn faster, depending on if the two people are trying to learn at the same pace. So like 5 days a week, both are learning 5 days a week. Yeah, because of the information, the amount of information, they're not overloaded with stuff. I think that is the big difference. I don't think that being 3 years old makes you a quicker learner. I just think it's the amount of information for both ages. But if you put the effort in, you get the rewards. I think that is super key with English.
You know what? I would echo your comments by saying the following. I think the difference is two things that come to my mind. Less fear, number one.
That is super key, yeah.
And less responsibilities. Now, I'm not saying, generally speaking, I'm not saying there are not children all over the world that have responsibilities, but as a whole, fear. Because I think that when we become adults, people are afraid of being ridiculed or chastised or your accent and stuff of that nature. Hold on one second. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an English call. You write in Farsi and you write in Arabic, I will block you. Just saying, English is a writing skill as well. So I thank you very much. Govern yourselves accordingly. So I do think it's fear, and I think it's responsibility, because I do think the older, for most people, I do think the older you get, the more responsibilities you say. See, I mean, Teacher Stewart, you sealed it. If you don't have a job and you're not able to take care of yourself and your family, it's like, are you hardly thinking about English? Or if you just got sacked from your job, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the key to that is also in your intrinsic motivation. If you've been sacked maybe and you're sitting on the couch just watching TV, maybe that's a bit difficult to be able to process the English. Whereas if you're like thinking, okay, I've got this amount of time, I'm going to put it into these kind of areas and I'm going to study effectively rather than sitting back, you know, that I think fear, like you said, overrules everything. Especially speaking, it is so key with speaking, fear. Like, people are so scared, like you say, to say the wrong thing rather than doing the trial and error. The best example I gave recently was when you first start a new job, you make a million errors on your first day, but you don't care about what you do as much as when you're speaking English. So, you know, this is crazy, really. But
that is a valid point. And TT, let me go back to something. I saw a comment. TTA, I believe you were making a comment earlier. They were saying that, hey, you can now hear the distinction between the British accent and the American accent. Yay, I'm glad.
Nice job, yeah.
All right, that's very good. And as long as I would say, please notice, this is just a pet peeve of mine, learners, so don't get mad at me. Is that I'm glad you can notice the distinction between accents. What I hope that you recognize as well, or in addition to that, is what Teacher Stewart said, by being understood. Why? Because we're fluent and we're focusing on our pronunciation and intonation. So well done on distinguishing between the British accent and the American accent. And it's funny, as a native, I prefer a British accent. I don't, particularly on women, I just go crazy. But I'm glad you noticed that. But notice our pronunciation, all right? Just notice that. I just think that. Okay, great. All right, teacher, listen, I've been asking you tons of questions, and I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask me any questions if you had anything. Learners, of course, if you have questions, I'll interrupt you, but he's our guest, so therefore I wanted to give him the opportunity to ask if he had any questions, because if not, I'll just keep asking him questions.
Yeah, sure. So what do you feel is the most, there's a lot of material available these days. What do you feel is the most effective way if you had if money was not a problem, what is the most effective way to learn a new language?
I think ideally is if whatever language it would be is that if you could actually go into that place and be immersed in the language. So if you had the opportunity, you want to learn Japanese, you would go to Japan, or if you want to learn English, then certainly go to the UK or Britain or the United States. Interestingly enough, learners, that there are I can only speak for America. So there are parts of, for example, it's like fully immersion, what you were saying. So ideally, there are parts of America that you can go and not hear a drop of English. But ideally, that would be the great case, because I have a friend of mine. She's lived in America her whole life, and she speaks Spanish and only Spanish because she lives in a Spanish-speaking community. Yeah, none of her family spoke English. So, but ideally, I think the thing is you go to that country where you want to learn the language. You have a propensity or opportunity to be more immersed than, say, in a non-country. Other than that, I think you make a very valid point. I think the beautiful thing about learning a language is that you have to find out what way works best for you. Some people love self-study. Some people love private tutors, whether it's face-to-face or online. Some people learn the language in terms of just music, or they prefer like a language school where I used to work with. So I think finally to answer your question is be willing to experiment on the different options that work best for you. I usually use this analogy, like if you're learning English, imagine you're in a big playground and you have all of these different toys you can play with. Well, if you like, if you like this one toy and the toy is working, great, but if not, no. So I think different ways. I would say this though, final statement, teacher, is this. I do think what happens is that given the opportunities, given the virtual plethora learners, since you guys say that I don't teach you vocabulary, plethora, P-L-E-T-H-O-R-A. Plethora means several or many. I would say this, Teacher Stewart, I do think with the many virtual plethora of ways to learning English, the aforementioned we made, social media being one, we're both on that. I do think there is two things. Number one, not everyone, but a lot of people. Number one, it has made people lazy.
Yes. That's
and number two, I think they use an excuse. I mean, I speak French, so I can remember 25 years ago, there was no YouTube, there was no Instagram, it was like flashcards, face-to-face, things of that nature. So as great as the many options are and the virtual ways they are, YouTube, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, all of those things, applications, all of those things, okay? I do think that people have sometimes used the technology and not used it as effectively as they could. Number one. Number two, it has made some people lazy. Number two. And number three, it has made some people thinking that they're entitled to it. And I'm like, the only way, I'll expand it in terms of teaching, I'll make an I statement. The only way I can get better at something is I have to do it. I have to apply action. I have to work it. I have to practice. I have to make mistakes, all of those other things. So when I hear learners say, or extended family, at least some of my learners and followers say, there's nobody to speak English with. I'm like, really? Do you have an internet connection? Really?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. It's definitely possible if you really want to find it. And it's a good point, the fact that the technology has really changed that relationship we have with hard work in a sense, because, you hear the stories of your parents working tooth and nail to get something done, something simple we see as very simple these days. And nowadays, there is a lot of stuff out there. You know what? I'm willing to say you really don't need a teacher to learn English, because everything essentially is out there. The one thing you need a teacher for is specifics about how to improve yourself, and especially speaking, because you can't do that on your own. That's really key, but it is there if you wanted it.
I do think, what's interesting? There was an article recently in terms of talking about automation within the teaching industry, right? So I do think, hold on one second, let me just read a comment. Yeah, I mean, well, I'm sorry, one of the learners said sometimes I don't like to talk about being lazy. You know, listen, I'll make an honest statement. I'm lazy sometimes. I'm lazy. I am lazy sometimes. I have to recognize that. Now, if you, let me say this, learner, OMZZ, thank you very much. If it applies, it applies. If it doesn't, it doesn't. If you think that you're lazy, if one of y'all learners out there think that you're lazy, then fine, right? So I personally think sometimes we're a little lazy.
I can 100% feel with that because I am super lazy learning Japanese. You know, like I say, everything is out there, especially I'm like a beginner. So there's enough material out there to get me going. And I live in the community, and alongside your friend who just speaks Spanish in America, there's an abundance of material for us to be able to practice with because it's all around us. You could go out of the outskirts of your community. Although I'm not within an English community, you know, I work in an English school, you can only speak English, and I come home, I have a family, I'm practicing English with my family so that my kids have to.
It's like you have major, it's like I think, you know, I think it comes down to I'm going to expand this. Anything in life, I have to have the confidence, I have to desire to do it, and we all have responsibilities. Mariana, to your point in terms of saying we don't need we don't need private lessons, that might work for you, and that's true. And some people don't need private. You know, it's an individual decision. Some people don't need private lessons. I would say this, for those okay, how do I say this? I do think 2 points, Stuart. What's interesting is I do think recently there was an article that was talking about the automation of teaching. And I do think that because of technology and AI, artificial intelligence, I think that that those technologies is actually going to change the industry more, and teaching will become more of a specialized service. That's just my own thought. I don't know, because certainly I don't have a crystal ball. That's point number one. Point number two is, with all of the available resources, if you don't need a private lesson, that's fine. But what I find interesting is that, let me say it like this, for all the amount of resources out there, for people that choose to do it free, there are some people out there that don't follow them, that don't accolade or anything of that nature. Exactly. They don't respect stuff that's for free, number one. Or number two is that they feel as though that, oh, it should all be given to them. So, Mariana, great comment. I think it's a personal decision. Some people like the value of a teacher, the value of a coach, someone to motivate them, encourage them. But again, I think it's an individual decision. Because again, as Teacher Stuart has said, yeah, they're readily available. There's so much information out there that if you do it, I would say it's fine. If you don't take private lessons, that's fine. But how many people out there do you know, regardless if they're teachers, let's say content providers, whether they're teachers, whether they're comedians, whatever they are. And a lot of times, there are people out there that take, and then you ask, oh, share your profile, this or that. And some of y'all don't do that. So I think there needs to be a medium that, whereas at least if you're going to get access for free or give information for free, for me personally, I think there should be a symbiotic relationship. There's nothing the matter with, like, after the live Instagram learners, I'm going to be like, yo, share Teacher Stuart's information. He's doing Instagram for free. You don't think you could share that if you find his content available?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. 100%. And just if I could jump in, I want to clarify a bit what I said. I said that you don't need a teacher, but that is only if you are like what our mums and dads were and can haul through all of that information and find your direction. I think teachers are key if you're someone who struggle with seeing lots of information and you need that direction. Myself, I've had a teacher for Japanese because I need that direction to wade through all the information, because there is a lot of it out there. There is a lot of information, especially on English, even in your native language, even in English, just in English, that can help you. But to wade through all of that is a tough thing to do, especially as most learners don't know what their level is to start with. So I think like a teacher helps to give you a base and then to help direct you. Not everyone needs it, 100%. Your dad was able to, for example, I say your dad, and my dad, for example, was able to learn the skill of mending a car without a manual, because he just tested and trialed. Once again, going back to the trial and error thing, just trial trialed different nuts, different bolts to take out to see whether the gasket was working, etc. He tried to do all of that himself. But it's the same for English. You know, if you've got the motivation, the intrinsic motivation to do that and be able to push yourself through all of that information to find the pieces you need, it's there. But if you need the help of a teacher, and especially so for someone in a country that doesn't have many native English speakers, the speaking is key, and the teacher is invaluable for that for you, because they can work at your level. You know, many beginners feel nervous because a native speaker might talk abruptly to them when they're speaking super slow, and a teacher can deal with all of those different levels of whatever the student's at. So,
good point. That's a really good point, teacher. Hey, AJ, I think in terms of getting the words, your words are stuck and getting them out, there's two types of knowledge, brother. There's active knowledge that you have and passive knowledge. So to get those words stuck out, you have to use it as much, whether you speak it right or and things of that nature. Zeglamena from Greece, welcome to the call. She wants to know, and I think we touched about this. Hey, Omar, how are you? She asked the question, hey, how can I learn English without a teacher? So what comments do you have on that, Teacher Stewart?
Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, LinkedIn. What do you want? There's so many platforms now available.
There are a lot,
you know?
But teacher,
Google,
you know what?
Google.
Yeah,
Google
right?
is your mother. Google is your mother.
Right?
You know, everything you need to know is there.
Teacher, I think that you make a good point, though, which is very valid. Again, learners, listen, I'm a face-to-face teacher. I try to change the face of English, right, on YouTube and Instagram. So I'm saying this wholeheartedly. There are many different ways to learn the English. You decide what you want to do. But Teacher Stewart makes a valid point, because there's so much information out there that some people need a teacher, to his point, to guide, to motivate, and to figure out what the good sources are. So again, I'm sorry, I was reading the comment, but I do think that is one value of a teacher, in terms of saying, it's like, you know what, because there's so much, you can get information overload. I mean, if you would think about just the amount of teachers that you have on Instagram or YouTube or Lingo Hut, whatever, a teacher might be able to guide you in terms of figuring out, hey, what's going on? That's number one. Number two, you know, a lot of people decide to make an investment in themselves, particularly for like IELTS exam or TOEFL exam, English placements exams, and or specialized English or English for specific purposes. So again, the bottom point that I'm trying to say is, learners, you have options. The point is, or you have opportunities. As Teacher William has said, normally, listen, you have opportunities, and when you don't take the opportunities, please do not blame at least me, because opportunities fall on you, actually.
And I've got one more little element to add to this, what ESL teacher Nick has pointed out in the comments. Not everything is correct. You know, it is free. So, you know, you look at like Wikipedia, and they say in schools never to use it because the content's done by any random individual that's available. And although most of it probably is correct, there's always elements of anything you find on the internet not necessarily being correct. I mean, the media, 80% of the time isn't correct, you know, especially with football transfers. It's crazy. They're just awful. But, you know, on like many different things, there's errors. So a teacher can help you to at least give you the precise information.
No, valid point. And you made me think about something as a whole. It's very interesting in terms of the social media. I've been thinking about this recently. Certainly people, you know, learning something is an individual decision. We all have obstacles, barriers, opportunities to learn. But I wonder sometimes, and I said this on a previous call, I wonder if social media, and again, it depends on the purpose, but I did say this to my learners. I want to get your thoughts. I wonder, because one of the learners just said this, hey, you can learn English on social media. That's true. Yet I wonder, is Instagram, for example, or YouTube the proper vehicles on that? Because it certainly seems there's a percentage of people, in my humble opinion, there's a percentage of people that want to be entertained on social media, that you use Instagram for social media purposes and not learning purposes. Now, again, that depends on the individual. But it would be interesting to notice, like, okay, if you look at major followers that have, in terms of like millions and millions of followers, is it in the educational field? again, it comes down to the point of like, what is a person's intent? But I did have a conversation. I'm like, you know what? Really? Do you want to be, and I've said this to my learners, do you want to be entertained or do you want to learn? Now, some people have said both, and I respect that. But my thing is, I'm like, at least be open to different parts, different ways of learning. And so if learning is accountable, I do think that there is a percentage of people that want to be entertained more so than to learn. And I think that's something to recognize in that.
I will. This is interesting because I honestly think that the amount of what people actually consume on, like, especially Instagram, these kind of platforms like Instagram and Facebook, I don't think they remember half the content they actually look at. You know, it's just like a viral video. You remember a viral video because that's like a special piece of content, but that's like the premium version. Whereas just our everyday posts, maybe you don't remember every single piece of content because going back to sorry, it's okay. I'm glad you're excited. It's just like you don't use it. You know, you just see it and you're not actually using it. So I don't think it goes in.
Oh, my teacher, real quick. Again, if it applies, learners, it applies. Teacher, if I played a game maybe like 2 weeks ago, or not recently. No, it was recently. I said, okay, the last video I did. The learners, the learners, my extended family. What are the 3 tips that I said it on a live Instagram? What are the 3 tips that I said for improving your confidence? Now the learners, the extended family wanted it. I said, what are the 3 tips? Most people are like, really? So do we want to be in, and again, it's a personal decision. I think a person has to know. But I'm like, really? You want to learn? You want to be entertained?
Yeah, exactly. And like
I put out, but like, really?
And recently I've been putting like a slang post out and then following it up in like 2 days time with like a speaking post to practice your speech with the vocabulary from that post. And many people comment like, what does this vocabulary mean? Even though I taught it like 2 days ago. But, you know, in my personal opinion, social media is meant to be fun as well in an aspect. You know, we're kind of invading it with our learning, if you want, and giving it to people, you know, in a sense. People just want to switch off when they do Instagram. So I'm not so bothered about that, but
no, I'm not. I'm sorry, go ahead, teacher.
It just means in a year's time, I'll just repost something that I've already done because I know people don't know it. In essence, I won't do that, but, you know, I could do. Do you get what I mean?
No, I know a colleague that actually done that. And I mean, again, let me be honest. I recognized for me that I needed both. Case in point, wow, you know what? If I put a bag over my head, everybody was like, oh. And I taught the lesson because part of this generation is entertainment. All I'm recognizing is I'm like, yo, at least recognize it, learners. There's a time to be entertained and there's a time to be learned. And can we do both? And also, too, is imagine when learning a language, allow yourself, ladies and gentlemen, to get out of one particular way of thinking how English or anything else should be taught. Now, I'm a crazy person where you will very rarely hear me teaching it. So I don't have a problem with entertainment, right? Because I don't want to be a hypocrite. The only thing I'm suggesting is I'm like, okay, learners, if people are doing free content, then at least when you have the ability to write it down or follow it up or things that's the only thing I'm saying.
But in the other side, they don't have to, you know, and it's like, at least we're given the option. If people want to learn, they can. If people feel that me teaching English is entertaining, then I'm happy for that as well. And some people just want to hear the sounds as well, don't they? So it's not necessarily the content that's important. They just want to hear what's being said and hearing the sounds of an American or the British accent, which is also fine as long as they get some value from it, which is important.
Exactly. And I think 2 points, last points on that. One, you said a beautiful word, opportunity. I'm going to use the word opportunity. Again, giving opportunity and value. And I do think that what becomes important is if there is a value, what Teacher Stewart does, then at least respect that value in terms of sharing his information or letting somebody know. There's a value in that. And oftentimes I do think that value sometimes is in the world of social media, people just don't appreciate the value. Oh, well, it's going to be there. If I don't get it from Teacher Stewart, I'll get it from somebody else. So let's just appreciate the value. That's all I'm saying. So great. Learn, listen, we got about 3 minutes left, and I want to save this live Instagram. So let me say this, Teacher Stewart, thank you so much for extending
No, it's fun. It's so fun. Interesting chat, 100%.
By all means, don't let it be the last time. If you ever want me to do a live on your page, let me know. If I have the time, I will make the time for it. I believe that, you know, collaboration, like I said to you before, so that's wonderful. So let me know. We can talk about that online, and let me give you any final comments that you want to say, sir.
Just whoever you do, there's plenty of fantastic teachers on Instagram. You don't have to stick with one, and please take in as much content as you can, and just try to take some part of the opportunity. You know, I'm not a fan of people who then say in 3 months' time that there's nothing out there when there is, and you've been consuming it for 3 months. So please take as much chance as if you really want to improve, if you really want to get to the next level of your job, for example, if you really want to move to another country, it's all about taking the responsibility, and you can't blame a teacher who's doing something for free necessarily for not putting out the exact content you want. You can pay me if you want, I don't mind, and then I'll give you the exact thing you want. So yeah. Don't cry.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, he gave an Arabic, if you're an Arabic speaker, he gave you the zubda on that one. Learners, listen, thank you very much for joining. I really, really appreciate it. Save this live Instagram. If you have a moment or 20, it'll be saved for 24 hours. So if you want to listen to the sounds or take notes, work on vocabulary, this is an opportunity for you. I will be sharing his information later. Again, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, we learn together. So if you like what Teacher Stewart does, let people know about him, English Sensei English. If you like what I do, let people know about Ask Teacher Will, because my job, my goal, my passion is to change the face of English. I want to do it with you, hopefully, but if not, I'm going to do it without you, because that's my passion. Thank you very much, Stewart, teacher. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night. Bye.
Ciao.